Horror is a genre often misunderstood and misconstrued, but one that has endured for hundreds of years. Join me as I explore historic literary horror and the writers and works that shaped the genre into what it is today. I'm Kit Claremont. Welcome to the Literary Horror Archive. So, some housekeeping before we begin. First, I want to apologize for the delay in uploading this episode. About a week and a half before the original scheduled release date, my laptop stopped charging, and I had to take it into a repair shop. My repair shop does pretty good work, and they're reasonably priced, but they really aren't fast, so it took me a while to get it back. Prior to bringing the laptop in for repairs, I had recorded most of the raw audio for this episode, but I didn't have any way to edit the files once the laptop was in the shop. And then when I got it back, it still takes a few days for me to do that. Because of this, I'm about 3 weeks behind, and I've decided to alter the season schedule to reflect the delay instead of overworking myself. I hope you don't mind. So, Season 1 of the Literary Horror Archive will have 13 episodes instead of the originally planned 15, and the episodes featuring The Lovely Lady and The Yellow Wallpaper have been bumped to Season 2. I've also moved the order of the episodes around a bit, as I'll be attending Masquerade, which is the off-Broadway immersive performance of Phantom of the Opera. I'll be doing that in early October, and I wanted to add my impression of the experience to our episode on Gaston Leroux, who was the author of the original Phantom of the Opera. The infographic with the updated schedule has been added to all of our social media accounts at this point, so you can check it out to see if anything else has changed. But other than that, I think it's time to jump into the meat of this episode, and once again, thank you for your patience. Despite being one of the most well-known American Gilded Age authors, as well as the first woman to ever win a Pulitzer Prize for fiction, Edith Wharton didn't publish her first novel until she was 40 years old. Best known for her novels The Age of Innocence, The House of Mirth, and Ethan Frome, Wharton was an extremely prolific writer. She completed 15 novels, 7 novellas, 85 short stories, hundreds of poems, and several nonfiction books on design, travel, and politics, as well as a memoir. Among those 85 short stories, a sizable number of them feature ghosts, a subject that held a particular fascination for Wharton. In the introduction to her 1937 short story collection, appropriately entitled Ghosts, Wharton quotes a well-known aphorism: "I do not believe in ghosts, but I am afraid of them." And truthfully, the specters that haunted her and populated her fiction were more of the mundane variety: distrust, isolation, loneliness, and violence. When ghosts explicitly do appear in Wharton's stories, they're often stand-ins for something profoundly banal. This doesn't mean they're any less terrifying, however. Edith Wharton was born Edith Newbold Jones on January 24, 1862, in Manhattan. She was the youngest of 3 children and the only daughter. Her parents were both from well-to-do society families who made most of their fortune in real estate development. Because of this, Edith and her brothers grew up surrounded by wealth and luxury. Anecdotally, some people attribute the origin of the phrase "keeping up with the Joneses" to Edith's family. Her father was the cousin of powerful socialite Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, a venerable force of nature in Manhattan polite society. Other famous relatives include General and Revolutionary War hero Ebenezer Stevens, Edith's maternal great-grandfather and namesake of Fort Stevens in Queens, and Frederick W. Rhinelander, Edith's uncle and one of the founders and eventual president of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I mention all of this because I think it's important to understand the sort of privilege that Wharton was born into if we're going to interrogate the psychology of her fiction. Many of her works reference a life of leisure that few could aspire to, as well as specific pitfalls that came along with rigid societal expectations. As a child, Wharton was educated by private governesses and was multilingual, being able to speak French, German, and Italian fluently. A quick-minded and curious child, she loved exploring her father's library and would often make up stories to entertain her parents and siblings. Eventually, she made the leap from play acting to writing, completing her first short story at age 11. Despite her privileged upbringing, Wharton often chafed against society's expectations of a woman of her station, and this was a theme that carried through to her work. Once it became evident that Wharton intended to pursue a career in fiction, her mother strongly discouraged her. She didn't believe writing was a proper profession for a young lady, and she even forbade her daughter from reading novels until after she was married. Despite all this, Wharton published her first poem, a translation of What the Stones Tell by German poet Heinrich Brüsch, at 15 years old. Her family was scandalized when they found out and demanded that the poem be published under the pen name E.A. Washburn, an acquaintance of Edith's father. Interestingly, the real E.A. Washburn was a well-known supporter of women's education, and Edith's father had often encouraged his daughter's curiosity and desire to learn. Because of this, I find it odd that her parents were so set against her desire to write. There were definitely some mixed signals they were sending, so I can understand why restricting her might have led to some confusion. Regardless, the same year that Wharton published her first poem, she also completed her first novella, Fast and Loose, which she had begun when she was only 14. She kept the novella a secret from her family for what are probably obvious reasons, and the work remained unpublished until 1977, 40 years after her death. Fast and Loose is sort of a precursor to the types of society novels that Wharton would go on to write, but without the nuance of her later works. Truthfully, I'd call it moralizing and a bit preachy, but in Wharton's defense, she never intended to publish it, and it's doubtful many people were writing literary masterpieces at age 14. When it eventually became obvious that Wharton's family couldn't suppress her desire to write, her father arranged for her to publish another collection of poems, verses, through a private publisher. Edith continued to write under pseudonyms or anonymously for several more years and had a number of other poems published in notable periodicals like New York World, Scribner's, and The Atlantic. Despite her obvious success, most of her family, especially her mother, remained disdainful of her literary career. What Wharton's mother did encourage, however, was her daughter taking her proper place in polite society. Wharton made her social debut in 1879, where she entered the marriage market and began attending various society events and balls. It was through these events that Wharton met her first love, Henry Layden Stevens, and the two of them began a tentative courtship. Much like most things that Wharton expressed interest in, her mother didn't approve of the match and tried to discourage Edith's pursuit of Stevens. Stevens's family was nouveau riche and didn't have the necessary pedigree to impress Edith's mother, yet the family was comfortable enough with him to have him travel with them through multiple social seasons. I guess mixed signals once again. And despite all of this, Wharton and Stevens would announce their engagement in the fall of 1882. Unfortunately, due to various circumstances, they broke it off shortly thereafter. Wharton's father had been ill for some time, and the family relocated to France in the hopes that it might improve its health. He died in early spring of 1882, and his death had a profound impact upon Edith. Despite his distaste for her choice of career, Wharton often credited her father with awakening her love of literature by allowing her free rein in his library. After an appropriate period of mourning, Edith and her mother returned to the U.S., and Wharton re-entered the marriage market. A few years later, in the spring of 1885, she would go on to marry Edward Robbins Wharton, an acquaintance of her brother's. Edward, known to his friends as Teddy, was 12 years Wharton's senior and from a pedigreed Boston family, so the match was considered favorable. Sadly, the two of them would experience a turbulent marriage that left deep scars on Wharton's psyche. Edith and her new husband settled into married life, purchasing the estate Land's End in Newport, Rhode Island, from Robert Livingston Beekman, a former tennis champion turned governor. Wharton initially hated Land's End, calling it incurably ugly, and spent tens of thousands of dollars revamping the house's facade, styling the interior, and altering the gardens and grounds. This was sort of the catalyst of her interest in interior design and architecture, and she'd go on to design and revamp numerous estates in the future. In fact, most of Wharton's nonfiction revolved around the subject, and she was considered something of a tastemaker among her peers. Wharton and Teddy would go on to purchase several other homes, the most famous of which is the Mount in Lenox, Massachusetts, where the two of them lived from 1902 until 1911. Unlike Land's End, Wharton designed the Mount from the ground up, and the home became a monument to her personal style and taste. She also published some of her most famous novels while living there, including House of Mirth in 1905 and Ethan Frome in 1911. Both Wharton and Teddy had a love of travel, so they spent many months out of the year abroad, returning to the Mount as a sort of home base where they could entertain the cream of the crop among their society friends. Among Wharton's contemporaries were fellow horror author Henry James, who we'll be discussing in a future episode, writers Sinclair Lewis and Jean Cocteau, and U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. Wharton kept detailed diaries of all her travels, and several of these would also go on to be published, cementing her not only as an author who wrote poetry and fiction, but as an experienced travel writer. Yet, despite Wharton's obvious success, things were not as rosy as they seemed. For much of his life, Teddy suffered from severe mood swings and crippling depression, and part of the reason the couple chose to retire to the Mount was to focus on improving his mental health. As an aside, it's very likely that Teddy suffered from bipolar disorder, but they didn't really have the language or medical advancements to effectively treat him at the time. Despite her rebellious nature and frequent criticism of societal norms, Wharton was something of a social butterfly, and these periods of isolation put a great deal of strain on her already fraying relationship with Teddy. I want to make clear that this isn't me blaming Teddy for his illness. Chronic mental illness is difficult to contend with even when there are adequate treatments available, but it's also important not to gloss over the very real harm that Teddy did to his friends and family due to his behavior. He was repeatedly unfaithful to Wharton and was at times verbally and physically abusive towards her. In 1908, Wharton began an affair with Morton Fullerton, an author and foreign correspondent for the London Times. This was the final nail in the coffin for her marriage, and by 1911, her relationship with Teddy had deteriorated so much that she relocated to Paris without him. In 1913, the two finally divorced, something practically unheard of for a woman of Wharton's station, after an agonizing 28 years of marriage. World War I broke out while Wharton was living in Paris, and instead of fleeing, she remained as a staunch supporter of the French war effort. In fact, she published a series of articles in Scribner's detailing the war effect on France and its people. She also performed extensive charity work on behalf of refugees and was appointed Chevalier of the Legion of Honor by French President Raymond Poincaré. Wharton would go on to write several more novels while residing in Paris, including Summer, The Marne, and A Son at the Front, based on her experiences during this time. Once the war ended, Wharton relocated to the French countryside in Saint-Brie-sous-Forêt, where she would spend part of the year in a restored 18th century manor and the rest on the French Riviera. Wharton only returned to the United States one more time to receive an honorary doctorate from Yale in 1923. In 1921, Wharton won the Pulitzer Prize for her novel The Age of Innocence, being the first woman to ever win the prize for fiction. She was later nominated 3 more times in 1927, 1928, and 1930, though she did not win. The Age of Innocence is one of several novels Wharton wrote critiquing the rigid social structures of Gilded Age society. In it, a wealthy Manhattan lawyer, Newland Archer, struggles with his feelings towards the scandalous Countess Olenska, while emotionally rejecting a more wholesome match with her cousin, May Welland. As is characteristic of many of Wharton's novels, none of the characters are wholly good or bad and are more victims of the restrictive requirements of Manhattan's upper-crust society. In the end, none of them get what they want, and the story ends moodily, if not unhappily. Written when Wharton was 58, it's impossible to ignore the influence her own struggles with society's expectations might have had on the novel, yet she was able to break free from tradition and spent the last several decades of her life on her own terms. In June of 1937, while visiting her friend, the architect Ogden Cogman, at his home, Wharton suffered a heart attack. She later died of a stroke after retiring to her home in Saint-Brie-sous-Forêt on August 11, 1937. She was 75 years old. There are a number of common themes in Wharton's work, particularly criticisms of high society and women's roles within it, unhappy marriages, shameful secrets, supernatural events, and hauntings. Because of this, it can be easy to assume that she drew a great deal of inspiration from her own personal life. Even her fascination with ghost stories originated with a severe brush with typhoid fever when she was 9 years old. Regarding this event, Wharton is quoted as saying, "When I came to myself, it was to enter our world haunted by formless horrors. I had been a naturally fearless child, and now I lived in a state of chronic fear. Fear of what, I cannot say, and even at the time, I was never able to formulate this terror. It was like some dark, indefinable menace forever dogging my steps, lurking and threatening. I was conscious of it wherever I went by day, and at night it made sleep impossible unless a light and a nursemaid were in the room." Amusingly, Wharton's home, the Mount, is rumored to be haunted, though most of the creepy encounters reported there seem to have little to do with Wharton herself. While some believe that the study is haunted by Teddy's ghost, other tales center around shadowy figures and tragic chambermaids with very little historical evidence to back them up. Wharton's first supernatural story, The Fullness of Life, was published in Scribner's in 1893. In it, a nameless woman dies and is forced to choose between the possibility of meeting her soulmate or waiting for her husband to join her in the afterlife. Without spoiling the ending, I'll just say that I think she makes the wrong decision. The Fullness of Life is unique, as it's told from the perspective of the dead woman herself, though many claim it can't be called a ghost story at all. Truthfully, I am inclined to agree with them, as The Fullness of Life has more in common with Dante's Divine Comedy than a traditional scary story. The last thing that Wharton ever wrote, All Souls, is a more typical ghost story. Published in 1937, the same year that Wharton died, it was written as an addition to the collection of supernatural tales mentioned in this episode's introduction. In All Souls, a wealthy widow struggles with isolation and loneliness, injured and alone in her huge, empty manor on All Souls Night. With no one to help her, she must confront the specter of a woman that haunts her home, as well as her own impending mortality. I suspect I don't need to point out the parallels to Wharton's own end-of-life experience, but I'll mention them anyway. Though she had numerous close friends, Wharton never remarried, and she never had children. While her home in Saint-Brie-sous-Forêt wasn't especially isolated, the majority of her social circle resided in Paris or abroad. It's very likely that she spent many evenings alone in her home without friends or servants, which probably gave her a lot of time to reflect on her life, especially when her health began to fail. Other notable supernatural stories in Edith Wharton's catalog include The Lady Maid's Bell, where a young maid takes a position at a manor house only to be haunted by the ringing of a bell that compels her to uncover her employer's secrets. The Pomegranate Seed, where a woman and her husband are haunted by the epistolary presence of his previous relationship, and Afterward, which is the focus of this episode. Podcasting is a rewarding but expensive hobby. Aside from the cost of equipment, software, and advertising budget, there's also a significant investment in time to make each episode come to life. Every episode takes days of research, script writing, recording, and editing before it's ever released to listeners. So while the Literary Horror Archive is a labor of love, and really my favorite way to share my special interests with strangers on the internet, we could really use some additional support. If you like what we do here, and you'd like to support the Literary Horror Archive, you can do this in a few different ways. 1. Spread the word about the Literary Horror Archive online. Discuss, comment, subscribe, repost, and share, and don't forget to mention it to your friends and family. 2. You can review the podcast wherever you happen to be listening, so that the great God algorithm continues to push episodes out to new listeners. And finally, 3. You can support us through our Patreon at patreon.com/literaryhorrorarchive. Our Patreon has exactly one membership tier for $1 a month, and it comes with benefits such as ad-free episodes, bloopers and outtakes, the ability to participate in polls regarding upcoming content, and the ability to suggest writers and stories for us to consider for future episodes. You'll also gain access to special patrons-only content, such as our yearly Halloween episode, which focuses on a specific horror trope in historic literature. Regardless of how you choose to support us, we're still happy to have you as a listener, and we hope that you continue to tune in to the Literary Horror Archive in the future. Edith Wharton's most famous ghost story, Afterward, is her take on a typical haunted house tale, but with a twist. One of my favorite quotes from Mike Flanagan's limited series, The Haunting of Hill House, is that a ghost is a wish. In many of Wharton's stories, however, a ghost is not a wish, but instead a secret. This is especially true in Afterward. In it, protagonist Mary Boyne and her husband, Ned, American transplants, are seeking a country home in the south of England after making their fortune with Ned's business, the Blue Star Mine. They're especially attracted to a particular property called Lang in Dorsetshire, which is old, remote, and badly in need of repairs. It's eventually revealed that the Boynes have chosen Lang, despite being presented with several better options, because of romantic notions of old-world aristocracy and the rumor that the house is haunted. In fact, the story begins with the line, "Oh, there is one, of course, but you'll never know it," referring to the supposed ghost. This is mentioned during a casual visit to the Boynes' friend Alida Stair, who has been helping them locate their dream home. It's possible that Alida is being glib here, since many historical homes in England are rumored to have ghosts, but this is the thing that really seals the deal for Mary and her husband to purchase Lang. After moving into Ling, where Mary and Ned intend to sequester themselves for the summer, Mary with her hobbies of gardening and painting, and Ned with the intention of writing a book, their idolized dream of English country life is slowly stripped away. Not by terror and dread, however, but by the onset of dreariness and boredom. While reading the story, you can sort of picture the long spells of isolation Wharton must have spent with Teddy while sequestered at the Mount. There's a sort of uncomfortable tedium as the reality of repairing the Boynes' new home sets in. After a few weeks, Ned begins to pull away from Mary, spending more and more time outside the home on what he calls rambles, long walks taken through the countryside surrounding Lang's grounds. Never having experienced marital problems prior to their arrival at Lang, Mary concludes that Ned's writing must not be going well and tries to give him space, despite never actually discussing the matter with him. This lack of communication and Mary's unsupported presumption of her husband's behavior are linchpins of the story's true conflict, a sort of action in inaction, which is an active choice Mary makes to keep from rocking the boat. It's on one dreary afternoon, when Ned has left on one of these walks, that the strange events of Afterward begin. While waiting in the library for servants to bring lamps so that she might read, Mary is struck upon the notion that Ned is keeping a secret from her. She turns the idea over in her mind, but quickly dismisses it with the excuse that her disquiet must be because of the house, because, of course, the house is haunted. While Mary and Ned are presented as a bit frivolous in the story, it is necessary to point out that Mary's deflecting is less flippant and more of an intentional desire to avoid examining her relationship with her husband. If something is wrong between them, she doesn't want to know it. Not really, but she can't help but worry regardless. So, of course, Mary decides to blame her uneasiness on the ghost, despite the fact that she's seen zero evidence of its existence. No one in or around Lane can furnish any specifics about the supposed haunting, only saying that she won't know she's seen the ghost until long afterward, hence the story's title. Instead of considering a different sort of phantom that may be haunting them, Mary seizes upon the idea that perhaps Ned actually has seen the ghost, and that is what has been weighing upon him. Given the period in which Afterward was written, when Wharton and Teddy had sequestered themselves at the Mound during the deepest throes of Teddy's mental illness, it's impossible to read the story and not compare it to Edith's relationship with her own husband. The fact that Mary's husband in the story is named Ned, while Edith's is named Teddy, both of which are nicknames for Edward, is also a difficult point to ignore. Also, I think I should point out here that I'm not someone who really subscribes to death of the author, especially when it comes to works of fiction. Art isn't made in a vacuum, and I think it's impossible for someone to create a work that's completely detached from their beliefs and experiences. This doesn't mean a writer can't write works that are purposefully different from their own point of view, but subconsciously it's difficult for them to completely remove their own biases during the act of creation. Or, TLDR, you write what you know, even when you don't intend to. Whether Wharton is intentionally interrogating her marriage through the lens of fiction is largely up to debate. However, I lean toward that being the case, as Edith Wharton was a highly emotionally perceptive and intelligent woman, and I expect she possessed enough self-reflection to understand that the parallels she was making were a deliberate choice. And afterward, as Mary continues musing on the possibility of Ned having seen a ghost, she's reminded of a secret passage that she discovered shortly after the two of them moved in, which revealed a hidden staircase that led to a terrace on the roof. While she and Ned were standing up there, surveying their domain, Ned had seen the figure of a man dressed in gray coming down the driveway and seemed somewhat alarmed by it. He called out to the man and then rushed downstairs to meet him, leaving Mary behind in the process. When Mary followed Ned to the ground floor, although a bit slower and more cautiously as she's prone to vertigo, she found the front door wide open and Ned in the library shuffling through some papers. Instead of the expected guests, he seemed to be entirely alone. When Mary questioned him, Ned deflected, saying that he thought he'd seen Peters, presumably a groundskeeper or a stable master, and had thought to ask the servant about the stable drains, but when Ned had opened the door, the man on the driveway had vanished. Although thinking it strange at the time, Mary dismissed it, and the encounter had long since been forgotten until the matter of the ghost occurs to her. Was the man on the driveway a ghost? Had Ned not realized what he'd seen, as the legend implied, until long afterward? Was that very realization the thing that had been weighing on him rather than some more mundane matter? While Mary is lost in thought, she suddenly sees the same gray figure coming up the walk through the library window, and is suddenly frightened, assuming it to be the ghost. As it draws nearer, however, the figure reveals itself to be her husband, finally returning from his walk. Mary meets him at the door, and they have a brief conversation about the ghost, though Ned seems distant and preoccupied. A maid arrives with a letter for him, and after reading it, he seems badly shaken. Then what follows is a peculiar conversation about the ghost, where Ned asks Mary how long afterward you're meant to realize you've seen it, which of course Mary can't answer. They're interrupted again by the same maid, bringing even more letters, and this time there's a letter for Mary. She opens it, and the only thing inside is a newspaper clipping about an occurrence at her husband's Blue Star mine. It seems that Ned is being sued by a man named Elwell. Then there's another tense conversation where Ned deflects all of Mary's questions, assuring her that Elwell is someone who held an interest in the company, and that the two of them have been squabbling over business matters. Mary wants to be comforted by this explanation, but something is still nagging at her about the whole situation. When she continues to press her husband, Ned tells her that the suit has been withdrawn, which was something that he'd been expecting, and that he only just now got news of it in the first letter. Mary accepts this answer and allows herself to move on. The next morning is a return to the comfort of mundanity, and Mary occupies herself with gardening. She passes her husband in the library on the way to the garden and feels at peace with Lang and her marriage. While she's out there, she's interrupted by the arrival of a stranger, a young American man who seems to be seeking her husband. Mistaking him for a tradesman, Mary tells the stranger that Ned's currently occupied and that he should come back later in the day, so the man wanders off and Mary spends the rest of the morning gardening. When it's time for lunch, however, Mary goes to the library to find Ned gone. She speaks to the maids, who inform her that he left with a gentleman around 1 p.m. and he has yet to return. As the hours tick on, Mary becomes more and more anxious when Ned doesn't come home. Trying to ignore her unease, Mary leaves the house to run errands in the village and doesn't return until later in the evening. She assumes that Ned should have returned to Ling in her absence, yet when she arrives, she finds he's still missing. Anxious and frustrated, Mary questions the maids, who aren't much help, then goes through her husband's papers until she finds a draft of a letter to a Mr. Parvis discussing the death of Mr. Elwell. If you remember, Mr. Elwell was the man who was suing Ned regarding the mine. Eventually, and perhaps obviously, Mary's mind settles on the stranger who she came across in the garden and decides that that must have been the man her husband left with. Now, obviously, the reader has already come to this conclusion, but I want to point out just how much Mary is going out of her way to avoid thinking critically about the situation. If there's something wrong with her husband's business affairs, she doesn't want to know about it. She would much rather remain blissfully ignorant and continue to benefit from the wealth of the mine. There's only so much she can do to ignore the situation once Ned has gone missing, however. Then there's a time jump, and the story picks up about a fortnight later. Ned is still missing, and Mary has been looking back on her conversations with her husband with more scrutiny. She remembers Ned saying something about how surprisingly hard it's been to get lost in England, which makes her wonder what Ned might have wanted to avoid. It's also somewhat ironic, given that now no one is able to find any trace of him. As the time between Ned's disappearance and any lack of recovering him lengthens, Mary sinks into a sort of hopeless depression, fully expecting that she'll never see her husband again. She stays at Ling, not out of any romantic sense of duty, but because she feels like her presence there is inevitable. Mary herself could be compared to a ghost at this point, someone doomed to linger in a perpetual state of liminality, unable to move forward without real answers about her husband's disappearance. You could also make the argument that Ned is a ghost, as his absence continues to haunt the narrative and Mary herself. Eventually, Mr. Parvis, the man that Ned was writing to about Elwell's death, comes to Ling to visit Mary and ask what she means to do about Elwell's family. Mary, of course, has no idea what he's talking about and presses him for answers. Parvis then tells her that Ned's dealings with Elwell were perhaps a bit shady, but perfectly legal, saying that what was done to Elwell was, quote-unquote, just business. He goes on to say that Elwell had sued Ned after losing the majority of his investment in the Blue Star mine, but had withdrawn the suit on the advice of his lawyers who told them he had little to no chance of winning. Then, after the suit was withdrawn, Elwell shot himself. Of course, Mary's horrified by this, and it sort of shatters any remaining goodwill she might have had toward her husband. Parvis then goes on to tell her that after shooting himself, Elwell lingered on in a vegetative state for about 2 months until he finally succumbed to his injuries. And that Parvis didn't mention any of this before, when the search for Ned had begun, because he assumed Mary already knew about it. He also gives her a newspaper clipping describing everything in detail that paints her husband as the villain and Elwell as the victim. And when Mary sees the picture of Elwell used in the newspaper, she immediately belatedly recognizes him as the stranger she met in the garden on the day that Ned disappeared. At that point, Mary becomes hysterical, as one probably would do when their husband is missing and it's been revealed they've seen a ghost. And Parvis tries to reassure her that she couldn't have seen Elwell the day Ned disappeared, as the man had already been pronounced dead. When Mary recovers herself, she questions Parvis about the day that Elwell shot himself, and it's revealed that the date matched the same day that Ned had hurried down from the roof terrace in search of the stranger coming up the driveway. At that point, Mary realizes she's seen Elwell's ghost not once, but twice, and that the legend of Ling holds true. She didn't realize she'd seen a ghost either time until long afterward. And that's the end of the story. We never do find out what happened to Ned, but I prefer the more cynical interpretation that he ran from the consequences of his actions, leaving Mary holding the bag. With his obvious selfishness in the face of ruining a man's life, I doubt Ned bothered to spare much of a thought about Mary before he left. He certainly didn't treat her with a great deal of respect throughout the length of their marriage, having kept so many secrets from her. As I mentioned, there are quite a few ghosts in Afterward, from Elwell's more obvious specter to Ned's lingering presence to the apparition of their marriage and eventually Mary's haunted liminality. And, as described in the first line of the story, the reader doesn't recognize any of these ghosts immediately, only becoming aware of their presence long, long afterward. Thank you for joining us, and please remember to like, subscribe, comment, and share wherever you happen to be listening. The Literary Horror Archive is written, edited, directed, and produced by Kit Claremont. Music used in this episode is Call of Fate by Alex Bess and Nightfall by Vince Adams. The Literary Horror Archive releases new episodes twice a month, every other Tuesday. Join us next time as we discuss the representation of lesbian vampires in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Christabel. Until then, stay spooky, friends.